So here at Current Affairs, we were so horrified by the latest column in the New York Times by Bret Stephens advocating an illegal regime change war with Venezuela. We've actually made an offer, which is that anyone who shows us proof that they've canceled their New York Times subscription can have a free 1-year digital subscription to our magazine, Current Affairs. Now, that is digital, it's not print. You get a PDF, but it's a subscription. If you want the print edition, that's also excellent. We appreciate that. But you get a free digital subscription if you show us that you have unsubscribed to the New York Times or The Atlantic, which we also despise. And so far, hundreds of you have already sent in your cancellations. The New York Times, we've given you your digital subscriptions. We've cost the New York Times over $60,000 in lost subscription revenue per year, which we're very pleased about, because we believe there has to be a price paid for publishing mendacious pro-war propaganda. Stephens' column is going to be the subject of this video. It's a small price for the New York Times to pay. It's rather a pittance for an organization that's so wealthy. But this column was so shameful that we think there need to be at least some consequences for putting out the kind of dangerous, deceptive writing that we're here to discuss today, because the human stakes of it are all too real. The more people put their money into independent outlets, the more good journalism we can do, and the less we will be dependent for news on legacy media outlets that publish harmful neoconservative talking points. So thank you to those who've canceled your New York Times subscription so far. Welcome aboard. We're so glad that you've chosen to read Current Affairs. You are playing an important part in ensuring that the media can't advocate illegal wars without receiving some kind of backlash. So please encourage others to do the same. Cancel their New York Times subscription. We'll give you a free Current Affairs subscription for a year. In early 2003, readers of the New York Times were treated to a column by the paper's resident foreign affairs expert, Mr. Thomas L. Friedman, in which Friedman claimed that invading Iraq and overthrowing its government would be a useful, moral, and sensible thing to do. Friedman wrote that regime change in Iraq is not some distraction from the war on al-Qaeda. That is a bogus argument. And simply because oil is also at stake in Iraq doesn't make it illegitimate either. Some things are right to do even if big oil benefits. Although President Bush has cast the war in Iraq as being about disarmament, and that is legitimate, disarmament is not the most important prize there. Regime change is the prize. Just by mobilizing for war against Iraq, the US has sent this region a powerful message. We will not leave you alone anymore to play with matches, because the last time you did, we got burned. In today's globalized world, if you don't visit a bad neighborhood, it will visit you. Now, Friedman did voice some unease about the potential war, and at one point he wrote another column in the voice of an imaginary pro-American Arab leader, instead of maybe Friedman asking a real Arab leader for an opinion. And in that, he mused on the possibility of merely forcing Saddam Hussein into exile, using the threat of war, rather than actually waging a war. But Friedman felt that a war with Iraq would be what he called good shock therapy, and would stimulate some real change in an Arab world that is badly in need of reform. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis would soon die from Friedman's recommended therapy, and the invasion of Iraq quickly became the worst crime of our century. And as the war turned into a bloody catastrophe, rather than showing any contrition, Friedman actually accused France of becoming our enemy for having declined to support the war. In fact, at the time, France should have been praised for its good sense and foresight. Now, there was little accountability at the New York Times for publishing such shameful propaganda for this terrible crime. And that shameful propaganda went well beyond Thomas Friedman's columns. The worst offender was actually in the news department. That was reporter Judith Miller, who was ultimately forced to leave the paper after publishing unverified stories on Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction, reporting which the US government used to bolster support for the war, and which turned out, as we know, to be completely false. And yet, while Miller was forced out, Friedman continues. He maintains a perch at the op-ed page to this date, where he pumps out vapid columns over and over, including his outright racist Flight of Fancy last year, where he imagined different Middle Eastern populations as different members of the animal kingdom. Iranians were labeled parasitoid wasps. Nor was there any hesitation by the Times in the years after the Iraq War to continue to publish calls to bomb or invade other countries. Subsequent years saw the publications of op-eds like "Bomb North Korea before it's too late" and "To stop Iran's bomb, bomb Iran," which was written by a name you might recognize, Mr. John Bolton. Now, the neoconservative columnist Bret Stephens has published many opinion pieces calling for or praising the bombing of Iran. He also, of course, supported the invasion of Iraq, although he's at the Wall Street Journal at the time. Now, because that type of guy always needs a new war, Stephens has recently turned to calling for attacking Venezuela and deposing its government. In January, Stephens published a column called "Depose Maduro." And now he's recently given us a repeat in "The Case for Overthrowing Maduro." And if you read this, I think what you'll find striking about Stephens' case for overthrowing Maduro is just how thin it really is. So Stephens says that, number one, the United States has a vital interest in seeing Maduro gone. That, number two, there's no way other than war to dislodge Maduro. That 3, Nicolas Maduro is bad at governing Venezuela. And that 4, while there is in fact a risk the invasion will plunge the country into a catastrophic quagmire, he says, quote, "We can learn from our past mistakes." Now, in this column, Bret Stephens doesn't even attempt to answer two of the most obvious questions that should face an advocate of aggressive war, namely, what right does the US have to overthrow a sovereign government unilaterally? And do other countries also have that right? Can they overthrow any government whose actions negatively affect their perceived national interest? What vital interest does he say that the United States has in overthrowing the government of Venezuela anyway? Well, he actually doesn't press too hard on the justification offered by the Trump administration, which has been menacing Venezuela lately. The Trump administration emphasizes that Maduro is some kind of international drug kingpin. As my colleague Alex Skopik has explained in an article on the potential for war with Venezuela and why it needs to be avoided, even the US government's own analyses have not identified Venezuela as a top exporter of illegal drugs to the United States. Stephens does link to a report by the State Department-funded organization Incite Crime, but the report he links to actually refutes the claim that Nicolas Maduro operates as a ringleader of the country's drug trafficking, portraying him instead as carefully trying to maintain his own power while dealing with the reality of powerful drug traders existing within the country. The report explicitly states that, quote, "criminal groups that have grown wealthy and powerful from cocaine are growing ever more difficult to control, and Maduro is trying to bring order to the growing criminal chaos." Now, that's a line that Bret Stephens doesn't quote, and the report that he cites actually destroys the case for regime change over drug trafficking, because, after all, if Maduro is not some godfather figure orchestrating the trade, then any Venezuelan head of state, even one that replaced Maduro, would have to deal with the reality of powerful drug traffickers. Removing him is not going to alter that fact, and a successor government is likely to suffer from much of the same corruption and deal-making. Now, the Incite Crime report says, quote, The Maduro regime's political enemies like to see the Venezuelan cocaine trade through the prism of the government's own left-wing rhetoric, depicting drug trafficking as a nationalized state monopoly. But in truth, it's more akin to the Wild West capitalism seen following the collapse of the Soviet Union, a game of wealth and power with oligarchs and gangsters jostling for position as an authoritarian leader tries to hold it all together. But if that is the case, then it sounds an awful lot like removing Nicolas Maduro from power by force could well make things worse. And so, probably sensing how weak that argument is, Bret Stephens in the New York Times mentions it only in passing. Instead, he rests his main accusation against Maduro on the fact that Maduro is supposedly a, quote, importer and exporter of instability. Now, what is instability? Well, as is often the case in US propaganda discourse, a stable country is one favorable to the United States, while an unstable country is one that contradicts or opposes US leaders in even the smallest way. And what's interesting is that Bret Stephens is actually pretty open about that fact. He says that Maduro is an importer of instability because the regime's close economic and strategic ties to China, Russia, and Iran give America's enemies a significant foothold in the Americas. Now, as usual, it helps to ask the question, how would this argument sound if any other country used it? Imagine China saying that Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan were importers of instability because their ties to the US gave America a significant foothold in Asia. Would this justify a Chinese invasion of these countries, or would we see that as blatant aggression on China's part? Now, as for exporting instability, what's that? Well, Bret Stephens cites the number of Venezuelans who have immigrated, which is millions over the last 10 years, as proof that the country is being governed poorly, and we may therefore legitimately overthrow its government. Now, he says we have a, quote, a moral right to invade because Venezuela's government produces misery for its people. Now, notably, he doesn't cite any polling of Venezuela's people to show that they support a US attack on their country, since the opinions of a population are, of course, as we know, irrelevant to the question of whether we should take the decision to liberate them. Now, it says a lot about the state of discourse in the United States that in a liberal newspaper, the so-called paper of record, a columnist in the opinion section doesn't feel the need to provide any legal justification for waging war against another country. Now, attacking a sovereign nation is an explicit violation of the basic principles of the United Nations Charter, which says the use of force must be authorized by the UN Security Council, except in narrow cases of being under attack by another country. Stephens doesn't even mention international law in either of his columns, because the right of the US to rule over the rest of the world, and to use Elon Musk's memorable phrase, to coup whoever we want, that right is simply assumed by Bret Stephens and his ilk. So Stephens is not only producing propaganda for what would be a criminal war of aggression, but he's barely putting in any effort here. His assurances that the risk is worth it fail to take seriously the disasters that can occur after deposing a foreign government with no day-after plan. And he doesn't explain why we should invade Venezuela, but not other dictatorial countries. I mean, if we care about stopping countries that abuse human rights, we should invade Saudi Arabia. We should invade Israel. If we care about stopping the flow of refugees, well, we should probably have boots on the ground in Sudan. So why is Venezuela being singled out for an attack? Well, as my colleague Alex explains in his article for Current Affairs, which is, as I say, well worth reading, well worth your time, the actual reason here is obvious and it's barely disguised. Large portions of the American ruling class resent that Venezuela's government has violated the Monroe Doctrine, which essentially has said for well over a century that Latin America is ours to do with what we want. And they resent that Venezuela is not slavishly subservient to the United States and US business interests. They reason that if we had a friendlier government there, we could, in Donald Trump's own words, get all that oil.
Venezuela. How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door. But now we're buying oil from Venezuela, so we're making a dictator very rich. Can you believe this? Nobody can believe it.
For Bret Stephens, the real reason may be a little different, because neoconservative columnists just always need new war crimes to advocate, lest they struggle to fill their weekly column inches. And what would a columnist like Stephens even write about if he weren't proposing new wars for other people's children to fight in? Sadly, at the New York Times, there doesn't appear to be any editing beyond checking for typos, and there doesn't seem to be any accountability. The Times editors have not made Bret Stephens answer even basic questions that his argument raises. They don't make him address the issue of, I don't know, is this legal? They don't make him represent his sources fully and accurately. And, of course, they don't seem to have learned from their own history of publishing vile justifications for homicidal atrocities. Now, here at Current Affairs, we do have one small way to hold the Times accountable for publishing Stephens' atrocious, dangerous opinion writing. You can just cancel your subscription. And you could subscribe to Current Affairs instead. We are offering a free 1-year digital subscription to anyone who sends proof that they have canceled their subscription to the New York Times. You can send that proof to help@currentaffairs.org, and we will give you 1 year free of the digital edition of our magazine. We're also extending that offer to subscribers of The Atlantic, which is the worst magazine in America, of which I have documented at great length in a 10,000-word article, so if you don't believe me, read that. You'll see that The Atlantic is the worst magazine in America, so cancel today. A lot of people read the New York Times because of the reporting it does, and much of that does remain important, but when you subscribe to independent publications like Current Affairs, like our friends at Dropsite News, or The Lever, or Zeteo, or The Intercept, or The Majority Report, or In These Times, you help our outlets build out our own journalistic capacities. And if sufficient numbers of people support these publications through their subscriptions and donations, then there's no need for anyone to get their news reporting from a publication that also, over on the opinion pages, prints justifications for war crimes. Now, it's true that a few people canceling their subscriptions doesn't make that much of a difference to such a large publication, but what it does do is exact a price from them for choosing to allow Bret Stephens to push views that, if accepted, will result in horrific atrocities. The important point here is that war isn't inevitable. But if we continue to fund publications who try to manufacture consent for war, then the cycle of violence will be much more likely to continue. Lives are on the line here. We saw what happened in 2003 when the US pushed a war that became perhaps the most disastrous conflict of our century. This was foul. It was indefensible. There has never been accountability. They are doing the same thing again, and there needs to be a concerted response. People like Bret Stephens and editors like the New York Times op-ed editors can't be allowed to get away with pushing this kind of regime change propaganda again.
Thanks for watching. This video is a product of Current Affairs magazine, the country's leading independent left print magazine based here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Go to currentaffairs.org to find out more about us, and currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our absolutely gorgeous bi-monthly print edition. Get it in your mailbox. You can also subscribe to the Current Affairs News Briefing, the Current Affairs podcast, or you can subscribe to our digital edition. Current Affairs is entirely reader-supported. We have no ads. We have no corporate backers. We depend on you. So please consider purchasing a subscription or making a donation to Current Affairs today. We are a 501c3 non-profit organization, and your donations are tax-deductible to the extent allowable by law. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.